It usually begins in the evening. Not with silence. But with noise that doesn't reach you anymore. The television is on. Not because you're watching. Because turning it off would make the room too honest. Your phone is next to you. You've checked it already. There are no messages. No missed calls. No one waiting. And then it hits. Not hard. Not dramatic. Just, clear enough that you can't ignore it. You're not lonely. You're just not seen. That thought doesn't feel emotional. It feels accurate. Because there are people in your life. You talk to them. You see them. You exist around them. But something is missing. Not connection. Recognition. There are people who know your name. But not your mind. People who know your role. But not your inner life. People who understand what you do. But not who you are. And the difference between those things, is where this feeling lives. You lean back slightly. The room feels the same. Nothing has changed. But something is no longer hidden. There was a time when evenings didn't feel like this. They were full. Structured. Defined. There was always something to do. Somewhere to be. Someone to respond to. Even exhaustion felt meaningful. Because it came from engagement. Now, the structure is still there. But it no longer holds you the same way. You move through conversations. But they stay on the surface. How are you? I'm fine. What did you do today? Nothing much. Words pass. But nothing lands. Nothing opens. Nothing reveals. And after a while, you stop expecting it to. That's when it shifts. You're not alone. But you are unseen. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because loneliness suggests absence. But this isn't absence. It's presence without recognition. You are there. They are there. But the connection never reaches depth. And over time, you adapt to that. You learn how to stay at the level that works. You say what's expected. You respond the right way. You keep things smooth. Not because it's true. Because it's easier. And eventually, that becomes your default. Not revealing. Not opening. Not going deeper. Just, functioning. That's when the first truth settles in. Familiarity is not the same as being known. Someone can be around you for years, and still never truly see you. You sit there. The television's still running. The sound blending into the background. And something becomes clear. This didn't happen suddenly. It formed over time. Quietly. Gradually. Almost perfectly. You learned how to be part of things. But not how to be seen inside them. It didn't happen because something went wrong. That would be easier to understand. Easier to fix. This happened because everything went right. You built a life. You showed up. You handled things. You became someone people could rely on. That's where it began. Not the loneliness. The pattern. You learned how to be useful. How to solve problems. How to carry weight. How to stay steady when things around you weren't. And that mattered. It built your life. It gave you direction. It gave you identity. But it also shaped something deeper. It taught you what parts of yourself were valuable. And what parts were unnecessary. You learned quickly that people responded to what you could do. Not what you felt. They needed your decisions. Your stability. Your ability to handle things. Not your uncertainty. Not your confusion. Not your inner world. So over time, you adjusted. Not consciously. Efficiently. You became clearer. Stronger. More controlled. You spoke less about what didn't have a solution. You focused on what moved things forward. And that worked. That's the part that makes this difficult. It worked. You were respected. Trusted. Relied on. Needed. And for a long time, that felt like connection. But it wasn't. It was function. You sit there. The television still playing. The light from it flickering across the room. And something shifts. You start to see the difference. Between being needed, and being known. Being needed is external. It depends on what you provide. Being known is internal. It depends on what you reveal. And most of your life was built on the first one. Because that's what worked. That's what was rewarded. That's what kept things stable. So you kept doing it. You showed up as the version of yourself that people needed. Not necessarily the version that was true. And over time, those two versions stopped being the same. That's when the second truth cuts through. You learned how to be useful, but not how to be seen. That line lands differently. Because it explains something you felt, but never fully named. Why conversations stay shallow. Why you hesitate before saying something real. Why even when you're surrounded by people, you don't feel fully there. It's not because they don't care. It's because they only know the part of you you've consistently shown them. And that part was designed to function. Not to be known. You lean forward slightly. The room feels smaller now. Not physically. Internally. Because something is becoming more precise. You think about how often you chose clarity over honesty. Not clarity in the deep sense. Clarity that keeps things simple. Clean. Predictable. You avoided saying things that would complicate the moment. You avoided bringing up things that didn't have an immediate solution. You avoided exposing parts of yourself that didn't fit the role you had built. And over time, that became normal. You stopped expecting depth. Because depth requires risk. And risk was never part of the structure you built your life on. You were built to handle. Not to open. You were built to respond. Not to reveal. You were built to maintain. Not to disrupt. And now, you are living inside that structure. Feeling something it was never designed to support. And that's where the escalation begins. Because something else is changing. Not outside. Inside. The structure is still there. But you are no longer held by it in the same way. The responsibilities may still exist. The routines may still exist. But they don't define you like they used to. And when that happens, something important disappears. Recognition. Not recognition from others. Recognition of yourself. You look around the room again. Everything familiar. Everything in place. But something is missing. You are no longer fully inside the version of yourself that this life was built around. And that creates a gap. A quiet, persistent gap. Between who you are now, and how you are seen. That gap is where this feeling grows. Not dramatic. But constant. And the third truth lands. When structure disappears, so does the version of you people recognized. That line explains more than you expect. Because it reveals something subtle. People didn't stop seeing you. They are still seeing the version that no longer fits. And you haven't fully shown them anything else. Not because you can't. Because you don't know how. You were never taught how to transition from being needed to being known. So you stay where it's safe. Where it's familiar. Where nothing breaks. But nothing deepens either. You sit there. The television's still on. The room's still quiet. And something settles in. This isn't about loneliness. This is about a life built on function, trying to hold something that requires truth. And that tension is starting to surface. It doesn't break all at once. It builds quietly. In small moments that don't seem important at the time. A conversation where you almost say something real, and then don't. A pause that lasts just long enough for the moment to pass. You're sitting across from someone. They're talking. You're listening. Nodding. Responding. Everything looks normal. Everything sounds normal. But inside, something is held back. You feel it. That small pressure. That moment where something honest rises up. A thought. A feeling. Something that would change the tone if you said it out loud. And then, you adjust. You soften it. Replace it. Say something safer. Something easier. Something that keeps the interaction smooth. It happens so fast, most people would never notice. But you do. Because you felt the original version. The real one. And you chose not to say it. Not because it wasn't true. Because it didn't fit. That's where the gap widens. Not in what you say. In what you don't. You sit back slightly. The conversation continues. But you're no longer fully in it. Because part of you stayed behind. Unspoken. Unseen. And after a while, that becomes a pattern. You start to hesitate more. Not just in conversations. In everything. What you share. What you reveal. What you allow others to see. You begin to edit yourself in real time. Constantly. Effortlessly. And eventually, automatically. That's when it shifts. You're no longer choosing what to hide. You're operating from what's already filtered. And over time, that filtering becomes identity. You become the version of yourself that doesn't complicate things. Doesn't disrupt. Doesn't ask for depth. Just stays within the lines. And the cost of that is something you don't feel immediately. Because nothing breaks. Nothing collapses. Everything continues. Smoothly. Predictably. Empty in a way that doesn't look empty from the outside. You reach for your phone. Almost without thinking. Unlock it. Scroll. Names. Contacts. People you've known for years. People who have been part of your life. People you've shared time with. Experiences. History. You stop on one name. Your thumb hovers. And something strange happens. You don't press call. Not because you don't want to talk. Because you don't know how to start. What would you say? Not the surface version. The real version. You sit there. Looking at the screen. And the realization begins to form. You're not afraid to call. You're just not sure who would understand. That line lands deeper than expected. Because it reveals something you haven't fully admitted. It's not about having people. It's about being known by them. And suddenly, that list of names feels different. Not empty. Incomplete. You scroll again. Looking for someone. Not just available. But capable of seeing you clearly. And that's when it hits. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with a kind of clarity that doesn't allow denial. There is no one who fully knows you anymore. You don't react immediately. Because something in you already knew. You felt it in conversations. In pauses. In the things you didn't say. In the way people respond to the version of you they've always known. But not the one you are becoming. You lock the phone. Set it down. Slowly. And something settles in your chest. Not panic. Not even sadness in the way you expected. Something more precise. Recognition. You've spent years being present in people's lives. But not fully present as yourself. You've been there. But not entirely seen. And over time, that becomes normal. Until one moment, when it doesn't. You lean back. Eyes unfocused for a second. The room feels quieter now. Not because the sound changed. Because something inside you did. You're not just aware of the gap. You're feeling it. And that changes everything. Because once you feel it, you can't go back to ignoring it. And the final line of this moment lands. You don't feel alone because no one is there. You feel alone because no one is seeing what's actually there. After that moment, nothing explodes. Nothing dramatic happens. You don't call anyone. You don't suddenly change your life. You just sit there. The phone is back on the table. The room looks exactly the same. But something has shifted. Not in your life. In how you experience it. You notice it in the next conversation. Someone asks you something simple. How have you been? And you feel it again. That pause. That space between what's true, and what you're about to say. For a split second, you consider answering honestly. Not dramatically. Just, real. But then something familiar happens. You adjust. I'm good. The moment passes. The conversation continues. And once again, nothing breaks. That's the pattern. Nothing breaks. But nothing deepens either. You walk through the rest of the day. Normal interactions. Normal routines. But now you're aware of something you couldn't see before. How often you stay on the surface. How often you choose ease over truth. How often you leave parts of yourself out of the room, without even noticing. And slowly, something changes. Not outside. Inside. You begin to pull back. Not dramatically. Subtly. You speak a little less. Share a little less. Engage a little less. Not because you don't care. Because it no longer feels like it reaches anything real. That's when the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. Like disinterest. Like distance. But that's not what it is. And the first blade cuts through. You didn't become quiet. You just stopped explaining yourself to people who weren't really listening. That line lands clean. Because it removes the confusion. This isn't about losing connection. It's about recognizing its limits. You sit alone later that evening. No television this time. No background noise. Just the room. And your own thoughts. And something becomes clearer. You're not avoiding people. You're avoiding the version of interaction that no longer feels true. That distinction matters. Because it changes how you see yourself. You're not withdrawing from life. You're withdrawing from the parts of it that don't reach you anymore. And that's when the deeper layer appears. Why this happens. Why so many men reach this point, and don't know what to do with it. Because they were never taught how to move past it. They were taught how to handle things. How to provide. How to fix. How to endure. How to keep going. But not how to open. Not how to say something real without turning it into a problem to solve. Not how to sit in a moment, without trying to control it. Not how to let someone actually see them, without adjusting what they show. So when the structure fades, and the roles become less defined, there is no replacement. No new model. No clear way forward. Just, awareness. And awareness without direction, feels like isolation. You lean back in the chair. The room dim. The silence no longer uncomfortable. Just, present. And something else settles in. You don't actually need more people. That was never the issue. You need a different kind of connection. One that doesn't require you to perform. One that doesn't stay at the surface. One that allows you to exist, without editing yourself. And that's unfamiliar. Because you've spent decades doing the opposite. So your instinct is not to move toward it. It's to stay where things are manageable. Predictable. Controlled. And that's where most people stop. They recognize the gap. They feel it. But they don't cross it. Because crossing it would require something they've avoided their entire lives. Vulnerability without structure. Expression without control. Presence without a role. And that's not easy. That's why they stay quiet. Not because they have nothing to say. Because they've never learned how to say it, in a way that feels safe. And the second blade lands. You're not closed off. You're just unpracticed in being known. That one shifts everything. Because it removes the idea that something is wrong with you. There's nothing broken here. Only something missing. A skill. A way of being. A different kind of presence. And that can change. Not all at once. But gradually. The same way everything else did. You sit there a little longer. Not thinking about solutions. Just, understanding. And for the first time, that feels like enough. It doesn't change in a single moment. There is no instant breakthrough. No sudden shift where everything becomes easy. That's not how this works. But something has already begun. Quietly. Under the surface. You notice it the next time you're with someone. A simple moment. Nothing important. A question. A pause. And instead of answering the way you always have, you hesitate. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. You can feel both versions of the response. The easy one. And the honest one. And for the first time, you don't move automatically. You sit in that space. Just long enough to notice it. That's where it starts. Not in what you say. In what you stop doing without thinking. You don't need to suddenly become open. You don't need to explain everything. You don't need to force depth into every interaction. You just need to stop removing yourself from it. That's the shift. Small. Almost invisible. But real. You sit with that for a moment. And something becomes clearer. This was never about other people. Not really. It was about access. Access to the part of you that you stopped showing. Not because you wanted to hide. Because it was never required. Your life worked without it. Your relationships functioned without it. Everything continued without it. So you left it out. And over time, you forgot how to bring it back in. But it's still there. It never disappeared. It just wasn't used. And that changes how you see everything. You're not trying to rebuild connection. You're learning how to allow it. That's different. Because it doesn't require more effort. It requires less control. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need a new identity. You don't need a new system. You need one moment, where you don't filter yourself out. Just one. Not perfect. Not complete. Just real enough, to feel the difference. You think about how long it's been since you've done that. Not in a dramatic way. In a simple one. Saying something true, without adjusting it first. Letting a silence exist, without filling it. Allowing someone to see you, without managing how it's received. Those things feel small. But they aren't. They are the beginning of something you never built. Not because you couldn't. Because you never needed to. Until now. You lean back slightly. The room feels the same. But something inside you feels less divided. Not fully aligned. But moving in that direction. And that matters. Because this isn't about fixing the past. It's about changing what continues. And the first line settles in. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to be known by someone. That distinction changes everything. Because it removes pressure. You don't need to open up to the world. You don't need to explain yourself to people who aren't listening. You don't need to force connection where it doesn't exist. You only need one moment of something real. And from that, everything else can begin to shift. You think about the phone again. The list of names. The hesitation. But now it feels slightly different. Not easier. Clearer. You don't need to call everyone. You don't need to find the perfect person. You just need to stop assuming no one will understand. Because that assumption is what has been keeping you silent. And the second line lands. You didn't lose connection. You stopped risking being seen. That one stays. Because it returns responsibility, without blame. Nothing was taken from you. Something was simply left unused. And that means, it can return. Not suddenly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to change how your life feels. You sit there a little longer. No urgency. No pressure. Just, awareness. And that awareness is already changing how you move. What you say. What you don't say. What you allow. What you no longer maintain. This isn't about becoming more social. It's not about fixing loneliness. It's about removing the distance between who you are and what you show. And that distance has always been smaller than you thought. You stand up. Walk across the room. Slow. Unrushed. Not going anywhere in particular. Just moving. And for the first time in a long time, there is no need to escape the moment. That's when the final line settles. You're not lonely because no one is there. You're lonely because no one has seen you clearly. And now, that can change. Not because the world will suddenly understand you. Because you are no longer hiding from it.